sort of never think, well, I always said that, like when I look at like the podcast and when you talk about the analytics and things like that, if you put them amount of people into a room, you'd be happy with it. You know?
Yeah.
So like even if it's 50 people listen to an episode, you think 50 people have took time. But in today's society, it's sort of hard not to get caught up in, you know, like millions of views and hundreds of thousands of views because you see it so much on social media and things like that. So, but I mean, thank you for coming on today and sacrificing your time for it. I appreciate you joining me on the podcast, and I think I always start at the beginning with people, but obviously we work at the same university, and that's how I came across what you're doing and sort of the work you're doing around self-authenticity and values, which go hand in hand with the podcast massively, which is why I thought you'd be a great guest. And the last time we talked, we sort of went through that there. But I always think the beginning is the best place to start. So I'd love to know how you got to this point now, how you ended up, you know, doing your PhD in these subjects in psychology, and how that story essentially started for you.
Yeah. I think, I mean, looking at my own past, most people in psychology go into it because they've got some sort of issue themselves. And that's, as we discussed last time, certainly where I came from with this. So I knew growing up in a very fundamental Christian religion, like there are certain things you must do, certain things you cannot do. And one of the major issues I had, knowing that from at the age of 11 that I'm gay, I'm not accepted in this religion. And then comes with that all these issues of, you know, I don't fit in, but at the same time I can't be who I want to be. And then because of that, it causes all sorts of like psychological issues, depression, anxiety, and so on. And then to the point where, you know, you're starting to think about things like even trying to take your own life. Not a good place to be in.
No, not at all.
And then when I got to the age of 23, I thought, right, I can't do this anymore. I've got to make a decision. It's either or, it's make or break. And my decision at the age of 23, 14 years ago, was, no, I'm not living like this anymore. I've decided that I'm going to accept who I am, accept my sexuality, and then move on with my life the way that I really, really should do or want to. So that's, for me, right, the fundamental area of where the idea of living, you know, a values-based life, living a life that's authentic, living a life that's based upon what you want, as opposed to what the people around you want, whether it's your religious peers, whether it's, you know, your family, friends, applied pressure from all of those people. And to some extent, you can go even further than that, you know, teachers, your government. So, I mean, in terms of sexuality, you know, there are places in Africa where you've got to be very careful about that. Being open about who you are, you know, that's obviously not a good thing, as far as I'm concerned. But at the same time, you've got to think about safety. So, like for me, for example, it was a case of, in terms of like looking at it as an equation, would I be worse off if I rolled the dice and started to live more authentically than how I am now? And the answer was, at this point, I might as well roll the dice. And 14 years later, I am thrilled that I did, and I do not look back at all. So in my mind, it really came to this conclusion of, I'm now living authentically. And sexuality is a small part of that. And then I started to consider, like, what other aspects of my life could I live more authentically at? And most of this is one of the reasons why I came to university, did a PhD. And since doing that, I've branched out into other things. But looking at authenticity as a subject in itself, it's so important.
It's massive. And I think that when we spoke about it last and going into it again now we're on the podcast, is that I think in society there's a lot of expectation not to live authentically and live to your values and, you know, do what, almost keeping up with the Joneses and do what is expected of you. And, you know, it's amazing how you turned into that, changed your life around, went from them, you know, them thoughts where you mentioned there about almost taking your own life, and then sort of rolled the dice, and now here you are living an authentic and a value-based life. And when you was, you know, in that period of, you know, in your formative years, being like, you said, you mentioned there, it was like 23 when you made this decision, you know, you were 16, 18, even younger, you said you knew you was gay at 11. How difficult was it to do that and make that decision, knowing, like you mentioned there, the the sort of expectation of your family, your peers, your friends, even teachers to that degree. How difficult, and what were the feelings when you were finally like, I've got to make that change?
Yeah, I mean, I might be a special case. I'm convinced that I'm somewhere on the autistic spectrum. So for me, it was very much a flick of the switch.
Yeah.
It was that simple for me. I thought, well, like I said, looking at it from the point of view of an equation, that's pretty much how my mind works. So it was like, if I do this thing, it could lead to this, but it will mean that those negative feelings will most likely be gone. Or I can do this, where these negative feelings will stay, but I won't be proceeding or getting any better in my life. So it was just like, well, I might as well just do it. So the answer to your question is, it was dead simple. It was just a flick of the switch. But saying it's simple obviously doesn't take away from the fact that there were a lot of potential downsides to it. So, for example, being in this very religious group, would I lose my family? High possibility. Would I lose my friends? Very likely. Would I lose work? Yes, probably. The religion I was a part of, very, very much, everything is interlinked. Everything is done in a way where you cannot be outside that group. I had very few friends that weren't in the religion. I was encouraged not to go to university, something that I wanted to do, so I did. Very much frowned upon. The work generally was all within the religion. You work for the people in the religious group. So there's a possibility that I could have lost everything. And I was very lucky. I know that there are certain people who have left the religion for very similar reasons, and some for other reasons, who have also taken the decision to leave the religion. And because of that, have been ostracized, lost their family, lost work. And they don't see any of their family anymore. They try to talk to them, they refuse. It's a terrible situation to be in. But for me, it was really, like I said, a roll of the dice. I mean, what can I lose? Like, whatever happens, it can't get any worse than how I'm already feeling. But like I said, I was very lucky. All my family stuck by me, which I was so grateful for. My mum, my dad, my brother, and my sister. That's all I really cared about.
Yeah.
I already by this point had a partner, so that was a great thing. I had his support. And in terms of friends, I mean, I had friends that were my friends from the age of 3, even younger, and at the age of 23 when I left. Obviously, they all decided that they didn't want to talk to me anymore.
Yeah.
And in my head, again, very simple equation: like, we're either friends or we're not.
Yeah.
And if you don't want to talk to me, I mean, to me, that means you're not a friend. The word friend to me implies some sort of unconditional support.
Yeah.
So your support is based on a condition. So by very definition, you're not a friend. Bye.
Yeah. I mean, it's a brilliant way of, being able to look at it like that. And it's so brave that, you mentioned the religious group that you was a part of, and, the expectation and almost the constraints of how entwined it was together. So to break away just obviously is an amazing piece of bravery. And, you mentioned there about it felt very simple to you, but even to, from my perspective, listening to you, just to be able to oversee it, break it down and sort of think about the moving parts of the equation, it just shows there was so much there that you did have to think about and have to lose. And I think what interested me about what you do here at the university and what the topics you've covered is that we all need to evaluate what we do on a regular basis, because I know from my experience that you can very much get caught up in who you think your friends are, the social groups, your job, everything you've mentioned there, even to an extent of family sometimes. You can just stay with them for the societal expectation of, I've known this person, I thought I was being a good friend because I'd stick by them, and then they wouldn't do it for me. And it's a hard decision sometimes. It's sunk cost fallacy, isn't it? And I think, a lot of us need to look into that a bit more rather than just be like, we're just doing it for the sake of doing it.
Yeah.
And moving on to, what you do now, you've got your PhD, which is amazing to me. It's a concept that's just mind blowing. It's so impressive. What was that like, finally going to university and, experiencing this thing that you'd always wanted to do?
Oh yeah, I mean, it was wonderful. Suddenly I can be who I want to be. I can do the things I want to do. I can see the people I want to see. In the initial moment, it was very difficult because I was part of a religion that was very confined and everything was very controlled. it meant that stepping outside of that box was quite a difficult thing to do. I was very scared. I was worried. I mean, I have no idea how this world works.
Yeah.
I don't know how to talk to people. I don't really know where to go. I don't really know who to see. So it was quite scary in many ways. And I didn't really know how I would deal with it. But like I said, I have an amazing partner who has helped me all the way through it, like helped me negotiate how to talk to people, something I still struggle to do on a social level. I don't know what to say. Like going into bars, pubs, I mean, goodness me, that freaks me out. Not so much now, but back in the day, oh gosh, I couldn't do it.
Small talk is a skill, and I think it's a skill a lot, especially we work in universities now that you don't see as many younger people having it. Because so many people converse through phones and things like that. But it is a skill for sure.
Absolutely. And small talk is something that I've never been good at. Like, if I meet you, I'm going to come straight in with, like, what's your philosophical viewpoint on whatever?
I love that. I'm all for that.
It's better, isn't it? I don't care what you think about Sharon from Coronation Street. I'm not interested. But this is it. It's like going into the world and then trying to integrate from the age of 23. I almost feel like I am, what would I be, 14 years old. That's kind of how I view it. Like, I've been working on this new me for the past 14 years. And obviously the PhD has really helped in the last 7 years of that, because you go into, like I said, psychology because you have a specific interest in something. And for me, a lot of it was just like, well, what I'm looking at here about being authentic very much applies to me too. The idea as a person that's trained in therapy for the last 12 years, which itself was a direct result of my own personal experiences of being in a religion, going to therapy, directly after it, having 10 sessions with this wonderful counselor. She was absolutely fabulous, and she really helped me. And then I thought, I want to do that. So I did, and I went into therapy work, and then coming to university and doing the PhD for 7 years and doing a master's degree for 2 years before that. It was wonderful because I started to think, well, let's create something now. Let's create some sort of program, or let's focus specifically on, like we said before, about like valued living. How can we encourage people in therapeutic settings or in coaching settings to help people like really think about who they are, really think about what they want from life, and then obviously most importantly, help them to go and get that. I mean, that's ultimately what it's about, isn't it? And it makes me think, there about doing these things and trying to achieve this kind of thing. That's something you said a moment ago. Like, when I was a Jehovah's Witness in the religion, it was very much like just walking through life blindly. It was very much like autopilot. And that's just one specific setting. But everywhere I go now, I can see it. I can see people living like on autopilot. People just going through the motions, like people just meandering. And I think most people, in many ways, it's okay. It's not such a bad thing. I mean, I myself do it. I do sometimes. I will just blindly go along with things because that's just it's nice. It's comfortable. But there is always this aspect of me that looks at people and I think, I mean, it's not my face to say, so I won't. But I do think to myself, you really need to focus a bit more on who you are and what you want from life.
And do you think that's from the lived experience? Because I can relate to that, because through sort of 18 to 22, I was very much just in autopilot, doing things for the sake of keeping friends, being a certain person and being seen in a certain way. And when I sort of disconnected from that, like I said, I still do it now. I'm not saying I live this, this perfect life where I'm completely aware of what I'm doing. This is why I do these podcasts and I speak to people, is because I'm always looking to get better. But I think the question I was asking before I got sidetracked was, do you think it's easier to see people who are on autopilot because you've had the lived experience and can sort of see them telltale signs?
I think so. I think so. Like working like therapeutically with clients is one way that you come to understand these kinds of things. The other one is, of course, my own lived experiences of it as well. And obviously, I'm not bashing anyone who's got a religious belief. I think that's a good thing. If it brings you comfort, if it makes you happy, that's obviously wonderful. And it's the same with everything. I imagine there are lots of things that I might look at that people do, and I might think, yeah, it seems to me like you're on autopilot. But You seem like a happy person.
Yeah.
You seem like a productive person. And a lot of what I've been looking at over the years really is like, ultimately, really, that's the main question. Are you happy?
Yeah.
And if you are, wonderful.
Mm.
And maybe for you, or not you specifically, but maybe for a person, maybe actually living on autopilot is what they want to do to be authentic. So wonderful. I think really that's the main point for me, the main crux of it. Like, are you happy? If you are, then that's wonderful.
Yeah, and that's where, these two important topics of which I wanted you on, of self-authenticity and values, are important, because without them two, you might disagree, but I truly don't think you can be happy unless you are in sort of living true to one of them two things, or both of them simultaneously.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think most people, if you were to ask this question to them, do you think there is a relationship between being authentic, in other words, knowing who you are, being yourself? Is there a relationship between authenticity and psychological health? If you ask most people that, they would probably say, oh, absolutely. So then the question really is, do we have research? Are there studies, empirical data that suggest the existence of that relationship? And the answer is yes. Some of them have already been conducted. There was a really great analysis done in 2020 by someone called Anna Sutton. She recruited, I think it was 65 samples. The meta-analysis, she looked at about 65 individual samples on all separate research studies that looked at that question: what is the relationship between authenticity and well-being? And she found a moderate correlation. So in other words, the more authentic you are, chances are the more likely you are to have well-being. I did a similar research study in my first PhD study, and it was the same question: what is the relationship between authenticity and well-being? And I found the same thing. I found a decent relationship, a moderate relationship. So basically, it does suggest, and again, it's not necessarily compulsory, so you've got to obviously be careful with that.
Yeah.
But chances are, if you live authentically, you're probably going to be happy. Or possibly, the happier you are, maybe the more authentic you can live. So
quite cyclical.
Yeah, well, potentially. I mean, I've no data to suggest that, but it's very possible, that one leads to the other. And after seeing that from my very first PhD study, I'm thinking, well, it's not just what I found; it's what Anna Sutton found with that meta-analysis of 65 samples. We have pretty, it seems to me, conclusive evidence here, based on many studies, that actually encouraging authenticity to make people happier sounds like a good idea. At least that's what it seems. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, I can't picture it of where if I was doing something that I knew, I can't even say it. I can't structure it without saying if I was doing something that didn't make me feel valued or self-thought, I imagine that would make me unhappy. For me, it correlates naturally that if you're not doing something you enjoy, it probably to a degree makes you unhappy. And I know people will be like, oh well, I don't enjoy exercise. I exercise. Sometimes I'm doing it and I don't enjoy it, but afterwards I can immediately appreciate what it's done for me, and then that makes me happy that I've done it. But if I was to be like, I don't know, like, oh, go and eat gravel, like, I know that that's not going to make me happy because I'm not getting anything from it. That's a terrible example, but yeah, I can't picture where doing anything against your values does anything then. It doesn't make you happy.
Yeah, exactly. And you're absolutely right. I'm sure there are instances of things that you feel you've got to do.
Yeah.
I ran 40K yesterday on a treadmill, and it's tough going.
Yeah.
But afterwards, I felt great.
Yeah.
And I suppose the reason I felt great, if I think about it, is obviously there's some sort of biological thing that's happening in your brain with that, which is obviously one aspect of it. But another aspect of it, for me personally, is that looking after my body, like looking after my own personal health, is to some extent obviously an important thing.
Yeah.
It's not the most important thing for me. We talked there about values, which is, as far as I'm concerned, and from some of the research I've conducted, it forms a massive part of what it means to live authentically. In terms of my values, looking after my body is pretty important.
Yeah.
It's not the most important thing in my own mind, but it's important. So health, well-being, in terms of like your physical body is obviously an important thing. So for me, running 4K on a treadmill, I wanted to make it 5K, but ran out of time. It's important. So I know, regardless of how difficult it is or how much I might not be enjoying it at the moment, it's going to be a good thing for me, so it makes me happy. It's as simple as that. As far as
100%. And then you mentioned about your first PhD, and then when you went into your next PhD, I know I think your thesis, I may butcher this, but you was looking at more of the self-authenticity and values in like sexual minorities. And then when we talked about it last time, you had some interest in sort of, you found that, you was doing it on sexual minorities, but then you sort of discovered that it applies to everybody.
Basically.
Yeah.
That's it. So very early on, I read these two really interesting books. And after looking at these at the very first stages of my PhD, one of them was about internalized homonegativity in sexual minority groups. And then the other one was about the difficulties specific that sexual minorities face in society. And I put the two together and I thought, if we look at the research here, the literature, there seems to be, again, a moderate relationship between how people who are parts of sexual minorities experience those difficulties. Minority stress is one of the main terms used in the literature, an idea formulated in 1985, that sexual minority people struggle more because they've got more issues to deal with because they are of a sexual minority. And it might be also the same for like ethnic minorities, and for example, disability, people who are disabled, that they are in a minority group, and because of that, they therefore have to deal with more stresses. And a lot of the research I was looking at suggested that because you have those extra stresses in life, that potentially has the ability to lead to you being less authentic, and therefore also then less psychologically well. And I remember looking at that thinking, well, that's an interesting research question. Is that the case? And when I looked into it in my research, in my second PhD study, I recruited a group of people who were of a sexual minority and a group of people who weren't, and then looked at the difference between the two groups in terms of their authenticity, and there was no difference.
Yeah.
Now, and I tried to make sense of that in my research. I thought, well, why could that be? Why is that? Why is there no difference? It could be because of sample recruited. It could be that because most of them were recruited from Western cultures. Like generally, Western cultures tend to be more favourable towards sexual minorities. There's quite a bit of research, and you can look at Office of National Statistic data that seems to suggest that actually these days, like most people who are of a sexual minority we are no different than anyone else. And most people in society have. It makes no difference to anyone. It makes no difference to anyone. So maybe there's something in that. Maybe it's a good sign that society
is moving forward.
Exactly, and you know what? That's great.
Yeah.
But that's ultimately what my PhD went. It went down that route where it was just like that was what I originally wanted to do.
Yeah.
Looking at authenticity specifically in sexual minorities. But then when I realized, looking at the research I conducted at least, that there's no difference. And again, caveat, it's only based on one study. But I thought, well, if that's the case, let's just open this idea of living authentically through engaging in your values to everyone, regardless of sexuality.
Yeah.
Which is quite nice because it means that the things that I'm interested in, the research I'm looking at, it's not specific to sexual minority people.
And I think when we mentioned there about society moving forward, it almost aligns with that and saying that, it removes them labels from people, and that, as long as you are authentic, you have, core values. And I think another important factor is that you are just a genuinely nice person, and you don't go out with the intention of, being an arsehole to anyone for no reason. And I think that what you've pointed out there does show that society is moving away from that. I think if you look in the past and through things, not just with being, gay or a sexual minority, people were a lot more ideology. They sort of had misconceptions around people of things they didn't understand. But now with, we've all got so much information that we can digest and divulge, and we can see that, I think people are learning a lot more. Obviously, there's still extreme cases in every aspect, different side, left, right, whatever. Again, ideology you align with, there's almost extreme cases. But I think if you can just be a genuine person and be open to the conversation. It's like you mentioned there about, you still know people in the religious circle that you was in, and they ostracize people like yourself and other people that's just their ignorance, isn't it? Really, to a degree, and not wanting to be open to learn more. That's, again, I think a lot of people that have these issues and sort of they don't agree. I know people in the past who don't agree with things that I believe in. It's not as an extreme, but there's people who don't look after themselves. There's people who don't prioritize, taking care of their body, their own mental health. And again, mental health has such a stigma, and mental illness. I think the language is changing, isn't it? Everyone has mental health, and now there's mental illness, which is different. And I've suffered with mental illness, depression, and things like that. And when you speak to certain people, like, oh, it's just bollocks. It's just this thing, blah blah blah. How can you feel like that? Why do you feel like that? But if you actually had a conversation with someone and was willing to explain what you feel, people could relate a lot better. And I think it's, again, why I like doing this and speaking to people who have different lived experiences to me and are in different sort of times of their lives or different aspects. It's really, it's just great and sort of humbling to listen to.
Yeah. I agree. I think the main thing you've said there that I think is important to focus on is the positive aspect of it. A lot of the therapy I used to do was, and you have to do this sometimes, you're working with a client who's really struggling. And it very much is like glass half empty kind of thing. And it's about helping that person to try and look at things with glass half full. A much more productive way of looking at the world, more functional, more pragmatic. And that's another thing that I really like about like the working on authenticity kind of stuff. And again, come back to the idea of values. It's about how to make you a good person great. Or how to make you a good person better. How do we get you from level 5 to level 6? How do we get you from level 9 to level 10? It's very much about like helping you to improve your life, like in a positive and functional way. That coming back to that point about people who are just meandering through life, finding things difficult, struggling through things, or maybe even not realizing like what they're doing in their lives. I have no real power because it really is up to the individual. Which in a way is kind of sad because I naturally would want to not necessarily change the world because I don't think I have that power. But I also think to myself that if I can help one person like to improve their life, it's all worth it. It's all worth it.
I couldn't agree more. And this is sort of where the book and the podcast and everything that I'm trying to do with that can help one person to give them something that puts the life on the right track. And you mentioned that you can't help everyone, and I found that difficult because of my background in being a personal trainer and things like that. You get certain clients and people who really need it, but they just don't have the buy-in. They can't appreciate the ramifications of not looking after yourself to an extreme degree, and it's frustrating because as much as you want to help that person, the age-old expression, you can take a horse to water. It doesn't necessarily drink. And how, obviously, my experience with that is on a completely different level. But from like a psychology perspective, when you work with these clients and people who don't, they're the horse and they won't drink the water, is that frustrating from you? And how do you sort of navigate that and not sort of take it as, because when I did it as a personal trainer, I was like, is it me? Am I not a good enough personal trainer to help this person? But then looking back in hindsight, it was more, again, what you said, it's the person. But do you feel that as a psychologist working with with clients sometimes?
Yeah, I mean, it is a difficult one. There have been times where I've been with clients and it's worked and it feels wonderful. And there have been times when you've been with clients and it just doesn't work. Just don't click. There's no bond there. Or sometimes you might say something and you go, why did I say that? That's such a stupid thing to say. And then sometimes you might find a client that works well with you but not with someone else, or works well with someone else but not with you. Sometimes it's very much about that. And you just kind of realize that you're maybe not the best fit for this person. In terms of the buy-in, though, in terms of like motivating people, I would argue, and that's one of the reasons I like this book, Habits, Happiness and Health. You focus on all the most important, intricate aspects of living a life that's full of like well-being, personal well-being, and in terms of looking after your body, your health, your exercise, sleep, and mindfulness, and looking after your mental well-being too. The buy-in, I would argue, is through helping the client understand and live by their personal values.
Yeah.
The values aspect of things is so important. When I started to come up with this idea, and my PhD supervisors, we had this idea that it might be possible that authenticity, living authentically, is very much understood and underpinned by your own personal values. And so we tested that as a model. We got all these different variables. We thought, what could predict authentic living? Like, if we looked at a person who was authentic, what kind of characteristics would they have? Okay, they're probably going to be honest. They're probably going to have a degree of honesty. They probably know who they are, so there's going to be a degree of self-knowledge there. They're probably not going to be that conforming to society. They probably won't really care much what other people think about them. They might have a good level of support from their family and from their friends and from their significant others. And there were several other variables. And we also included in that openness to experience, behavioral awareness, and as far as I'm concerned, theoretically, most importantly, valued living. They're probably going to live a values-based life. We put them all into a model, ran this glorious analysis, and it's just really, I'm an absolute nerd when it comes to statistics. And then it showed, out of all of them, when you run it all together in the same model, the most important predictor, the strongest predictor, was valued action.
Wow.
So what does that mean? That basically means then that understanding what your values are and then living by them is the thing that's probably going to be most predictive of you living authentically. So then the question for me is, what on earth can you do with clients to make them live more authentically?
Yeah.
You help them to understand what their values are. You then help them to understand how to live more closely by their values. That's how you get the buy-in. So if I had a client in front of me and I said to them, oh, I want you to go and try this, I want you to try that, I want you to go away and think about 3 ways that you can improve your life this way, they might listen to that and be like, well, that doesn't work for me. The real way to do it would be to say to the client, let's work out the kind of person you are. What things are most important to you in your life? And then the client, it might take some time and it might take some exploration, but they might say to you, well, do you know the things that are truly important to me in life? The things that I value actually are like the relationships that I have, my health, my body. I really, really want to try and get back in employment. Okay, so those 3 things seem to be important to you. And there are ways that we can help clients work out what values are important to them. But those 3 seem to be important, right? Where do you currently feel you are in terms of how you engage in those values? And then the client might say, well, not very good. I'm not doing very well with these things. I mean, it might be one of the reasons why I'm seeing a therapist. And then the question as a therapist is, right, okay, so we've worked out what most important values are and the extent in which you're living by them. So now the third step, and arguably the most important step here, is how can we get you now over the course of the next week, the week after, and the course of our entire therapy over the next 10 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever, how can we get you to engage more in those values-based actions? So in terms of employment, for example, you said that you're struggling because you're not in employment. So what kind of little goals or little things could you set yourself to try and get yourself back into employment? It's not going to be easy because, as you've discussed before, you've got issues with this or issues with that. But let's try and work out some achievable goals in line with those values. A good example of that would be, I love hiking. I love climbing mountains. I adore mountains. I don't do it as much as I want to, but I love it. It's experiencing nature and the environment is something I value.
Yeah.
But it would be silly of me to talk to a therapist and say, I want to climb Mount Everest, because it's just not going to happen. It won't happen for several reasons. One, my partner has banned me from climbing Everest. Second reason is that it's probably not going to be possible because I'm just not fit enough. And there are probably several other reasons too, in terms of costs and so on. So as a therapist, I would say to myself, all right, you can't climb Everest because it's not attainable. It's not realistic. What can you do? Okay, well, there is a nice mountain there where I live called Melfamai. I've climbed it several times. I could climb that. Or what about Iarwyddfa, Snowdon in Wales? I've never actually climbed that. Maybe that. So there are ways of helping clients realize that you have this huge overarching goal that's in line with your values. And that's wonderful. But if you try and attain that now, you're probably going to be upset about the fact you can't. So let's try and focus on something smaller, something that is obviously related to your values, but something that you can achieve. And generally, the response to that is when the person is able to achieve that small little values-based goal, it makes them want to try more.
The snowball effect.
Yeah, you want to try more. The definition of values in some of the literature I've looked at is it's an appetitive, ongoing process. So you engage in it once, and obviously because you've engaged in something that's important to you, that sends all these like messages to your brain. Like, it's a dopamine kick.
Yeah.
Oh, that was really fun. I enjoyed that. Well, of course you did, because it's something important to you.
Yeah.
And what does that do? Well, I want to do it again. I want to do more. Well, of course you do.
Yeah.
You know, and that's the way I like to view like a lot of the therapeutic work with clients in terms of values. You do these things that are the most predictive thing of authenticity. You engage in it once, you want to engage in it again, and then you want to engage in it again and again and again and again. And before you know it, you're living authentically.
Yeah. And then the habits are in place to live authentically.
Exactly.
And it's so interesting that you mentioned though, like almost reverse engineering from the biggest goal and sort of figuring out how you would get there, and then sort of working back to the steps that are attainable and achievable. That's a brilliant way of looking at it, you know, sort of like you said, though, I'd love to climb Everest, but I can't, so what can I do in the meantime? And then you say, oh, well, I've climbed that one now, here's another one that's a bit more challenging and a bit more local, and then I do that, and then, a fantastic way of looking at it, and I reckon a lot of people could take a lot from that, of thinking, I have this massive goal. But, you know, well, it's like me, you know, I'd love a podcast studio and it'd be my main job, but to think that it's attainable or achievable to, you know, be episode 50 or whatever this is, and be at that point without all these precursors of, you know, you've been on a reality TV show before and you had this. I mean, you look at all these massive new podcasts and places like that, a lot of them, they're already recognizable people, so to align myself with them would only be causing me, you know, negative thoughts and being like, oh, well, why am I doing it? But if you look at it from that perspective of like, well, that is the end goal. What do I do to ensure that I get there, or as close to there as possible, or where you work back at the steps of what you think is achievable? And that's a really interesting way of looking at it. And I think it's so interesting to hear you talk about the different, you know, routes and sort of applications, what you do with clients. And is there any more similar to that one that you think is a go-to? You know, you mentioned there about like almost the reverse engineering aspect. Is there any more that you've used in the past that help people?
I mean, yeah, for me personally, I have. I mean, I trained in cognitive behavioral therapy, psychodynamic therapy, and person-centered therapy. There are all sorts of ways that you can work with clients to get them to the position that they want to be in. Sometimes you might look at the situation and say, well, like, tell me about your past or your childhood, because maybe that might be the key to unlocking the issues that they're experiencing. Maybe the client needs more hands-on work. You know, I have a problem, I need to fix it. So you might employ something more CBT based. Maybe the person's having negative automatic thoughts. You know, I can't help it, it's just how I think. And then you might go through a few exercises to help them start thinking, well, but if you look at it like this, or if you look at it like that, actually, the power is no longer in your hands. So just don't worry about it. Obviously, easier said than done, but that's why you see a therapist. And then, of course, in my opinion, person-centered therapy is the best one, where you just sit with the client.
You just answered my next question.
I'm a big fan of person-centered therapy. You sit with the client and let them talk. You know, how do you feel? You know, it's a bit of a cliche, but you know, so how are you feeling? You know? But that does the world of good.
A lot of people just want to be heard sometimes,
really do,
and I think they don't have again, coming back to self-authenticity and things like that, they might not have a group where they can be authentic or feel that they can, you know, open themselves out. That's something I've struggled with in the past in certain friendship groups and dealing with things like loneliness and things. You don't always necessarily feel you can, you know, open up, and if you're bottling things up, well, that just makes everything 10 times worse. So for me, I always use like the analogy that it's like a pressure cooker. If the lid's tipping, you just one action or one moment away from just exploding. So obviously there's always going to be pressure. Pressure is good in certain aspects, I believe, but you know, you don't want to have no pressure. you don't want to have max pressure. It's sort of finding that happy medium.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, that analogy, we've used that in aspects of CBT and person-centered therapy as well. A Coke bottle, that's about ready to explode. You don't, if you know that it's about to go, you don't open it.
Yeah.
Because it's just everywhere. You know what you do. You've got to slowly open it and let it sort of release. Otherwise it'll just go off. And it's the same idea with therapy. Like, you might get a client in who's obviously struggling with something, so give them the space to talk, give them the space to be who they are. Carl Rogers, who came up with using the idea of person-centered therapy, I think it was back in the 50s or 60s. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant idea. Give the person the space to discuss their feelings. Give them unconditional positive regard. Make sure that whatever happens, you're not judging them. And what that basically does for the client, maybe they've never experienced this before, maybe they have, but it gives them the space to be whoever they want to be. In this room right now, you can say or do whatever you want, as long as obviously we're not going to be discussing things that are potentially illegal or so on. But you can say absolutely anything, and it will not phase, or it will not do anything. It will not hurt anyone. And that itself is a powerful thing. And I particularly like the fact that, I remember studying Carl Rogers, like I said, about 12 years ago when I started therapy work. And when I started to look into the values research, specifically looking at authenticity, Carl Rogers discussed it. And I'm just like, oh, fancy that. Fancy that. This guy who came up with this wonderful idea of therapy on how to help clients be who they are by giving them the space to do so, also discussed the importance of values and discussed the importance of authenticity. Well, of course he did. That's what his research was about. So when I read that, I'm just like, well, that makes me happy, because it feels like I've almost come full circle. And I've gone from looking at this and applying it therapeutically to now creating the tools, which is what I did in my thesis, to help clients to do that very same thing. It's
very affirming, I imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also affirming because the research that I carried out, looking at experimentally whether the development of the project I made worked, to a certain extent it did work, by helping clients, like we said before, look at what their values are and doing it sort of as a backwards approach, working out what their values are, looking at how closely they live by them, and then helping them engage in their values for a week, did have a positive impact on their authenticity levels, which we predicted it would based upon the findings we discussed before, and also it improved their psychological health. So that's again good to see. At some point I will get that published as well, because it's a contribution to the scientific community. Well, at least I want it to be. But no, it's obviously a good thing, and get that out, and once it's published, then other psychologists can read it, potentially therapists or clinicians can read it, and then can say, oh, that's an interesting approach. I like the way that he did that, or did this or the other. I'm going to try that in my own therapeutic practice, and arguably, hopefully, it will work for their clients.
And a question that I want to ask you, and it's a term or a phrase that gets, well, obviously it might be because it's in my echo chamber of, I listen to a lot of like self-help, like motivational topics like this, but very much I hear a lot is that everybody should have therapy. Is that a statement you agree with?
Yeah. My initial gut reaction is obviously yes, but I don't know really. I've got friends who I think would say no to that if oh, I don't want to see a therapist, or I don't need to see a therapist, and they might be right. Interestingly enough, again, this comes back to that point I was mentioning before about like believing the person has like the agency, the free will to decide what they want to do with their lives and what they think is best for them. So if you think the best thing for you is to not see a therapist and you're happy about that, then fine. Ultimately, if you're happy, whatever. There have been many instances in the past, people I've spoken to, where they've told me, so casually, not in a professional setting, about how they feel, and all that's going through my head is, you need to see a therapist. And again, not for any other reason, that it just would be good for you just to get this off your chest, talk to a professional about it, see what they think, and get a bit of insight from people that know this stuff, that have read about this stuff and understand this stuff. But ultimately, really, if the client doesn't want to go, or doesn't need it, or doesn't feel they need it, then fine. Like I know many people who who don't want to see therapists, and maybe some of it is like social,
like a reluctance.
yeah, a social issue, a
Yeah,
reluctance to it. Maybe because it's maybe something related to stigma in men, for example. But again, I've seen so many like lovely little stories of men who don't want to see a therapist, but they're happy to join like a group. Like
Yeah.
I believe there's a really great one nearby where I live called, I think it's like Men in Sheds or something,
Oh, right, yeah.
or Men with Sheds or something like that. And it's just like a social group for men where they can just go and they can engage.
Gives them that
in
release.
Things. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Please just engage in maybe some activities or something, or they go walking or something. And just as they're walking, they can have a chat. I remember discussing this with who was it? I think it was something related to like the local football team, Wrexham. Like you ask a man how he's feeling, and he might be very reluctant to tell you. But then you go to a football match, where he's surrounded by his mates. He has a pint, he'll have a few drinks, and then the football match is on. And just as the football match is on, or during the half time, it's like, oh, how are you doing, John? Oh, I'm not so good. Not so good. I'm really struggling, actually. Well, tell me about it. You know what I mean? And actually, that in itself is its own kind of therapy.
Yeah.
It might not be like client and like professional led therapy. It's not like you're sitting in a room, but those kind of conversations are just as important.
And that's sort of where my point of my experience before is when you have that community or that group or that friend where you can have them conversations. That's so therapeutic in its own regard. And you touched on it slightly there. The next question that I wanted to ask after that is, why do you think there is a misconception or a stigma around therapy? Is it because of, I remember when I was younger, that if you was, a lad or you spoke to an older generation man, they'd be like, why would you talk about your feelings? Why would you do this? Why would you do that? And do you think a lot of it comes from that is almost exposing yourself? Because I can imagine therapy is something that I would love to do, and I've contemplated doing it, and for lack of a better reason, just never got round to it. But I don't really have a disposition or an issue with exposing myself in that regard. I mean, this is quite therapeutic and cathartic to do. I feel like it's quite exposing to have conversations with people. But do you think that is without putting words in your mouth, do you think that is a factor of the stigma, is the exposure?
It's very possible. And again, it's the kind of thing that I think I can only concretely answer if I did a research study on it, or looked at data or something. I have a few ideas, a few thoughts that maybe something related to men talking about their feelings. It's not the done thing.
No.
I feel like I probably have a free pass. As a gay man, I can easily talk about my feelings.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether people would expect me to or not, but if they did, no one's going to accuse me of anything, are they? No one's going to be like, oh, you're talking about your feelings. That's a bit gay, isn't it? Well, what do you expect? Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's very possible.
Yeah.
My dad talks about his feelings.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily understand why that would be a negative thing, or why people need to talk about how they feel.
100%.
I've got a few people, a few customers, a few old friends. One of them, her son killed himself. Very sad. But her other two sons, she said to me, I'm always checking on them. Tell me how you're feeling. We must talk about how we feel. And she's basically forced them to do that. Forced them to open up and talk about how they feel.
Yeah.
Because I think she realizes they've got to.
Yeah.
And I think that's important.
Yeah.
And like I said, it doesn't have to necessarily be the medium of therapy. Sometimes doing it from your friends. Maybe another aspect, another thing that we could consider. I don't particularly think that the word therapy is like a dirty word. It's a very, very positive word. But rather than say, I don't want to go and see a therapist, you could look at it as actually, well, it's not a case of I have a problem in terms of my feelings. Actually, I just need to talk to someone about, like I said before, getting from good to great. You might call that person a coaching psychologist.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a therapist. Oh no, but I don't want to do that because that might make me look a bit, funny in front of my friends. Well, it's not what it's about. It's about helping you go from here to here. There's no shame.
And that's why the sports psychologist. I imagine
exactly.
If I have a good friend of mine, he's been on the podcast. He's a sports psychologist, and if you was a rugby player or a football player, and he told you your friends in that group that, oh, we're seeing a therapist, I reckon they'd be like hush hush and taboo. I'm assuming, but from my experience, I imagine that'd be the case. But if you was in that sporting circle or them sort of, you know, demographics, and you went, oh, we're seeing a sports psychologist, they'd be like, that's amazing. Cool. How do I sign up for that? But when in reality, that from when I spoke to Harry on the podcast and I've spoken to him off air and, you know, just as friends and talk about what they discuss, it's as,
I bet,
it's as intimate and as, you know, exposing as what I imagine normal therapy could be like.
I was going to say that. I was going to say that next. It's just a fact that if you're probably, I mean, again, I'm assuming this, but just said it, so I'm going to go with it. You have a problem in your rugby right now. You're just not playing as well as you wanted to. You know, is everything okay? Like, what's happening at home, or you know, how's your family life, or is there something going on in the background? And I imagine just that conversation itself in the person going for the therapy might trigger all sorts of issues and things that absolutely are no way related to the sport they play, but will have a massive impact on their ability to play that sport. So there's no reason whatsoever why that wouldn't be discussed in the sports psychology, I imagine. But again, that's exactly the point, isn't it? Oh, you've seen a sports psychologist? Oh, awesome! That's really cool. You know, I imagine they're helping you with you know, the way you kick the ball, the technique. No. It's much more in depth.
It's just the terminology slightly different.
The words we use.
And before we wrap up, because I'm assuming we've just smashed, you know, nearly an hour off, and it was we could go for hours. We know we can, but there's always two questions that I ask people on the podcast, and the first one is, and I think it'd be really good to hear this from you, and I can imagine one of them. I'm going to guess that I know one. It'll be confirmed in a minute. If there was 3 habits or values in this regard that, you know, you would recommend to the everyday person that you've experienced and gave you benefit, what would them 3 be and why?
It's a good question. The only problem with the question is it's based upon the fact that what works for me is going to work for everyone else, and that's just not the case. I can tell you about the 3 for me. I mean, I am, in terms of my personal values, and you can imagine that because I've been studying it for the last 7 years. I value freedom. I value relationships. I value environment. I value experience, adventure. And most of those things can be encapsulated in some very, very basic actions. So, for example, traveling, going on holiday. That's a great one because that ticks off several of my values. My desire to be like in mountains, to enjoy like good vistas, experience like mountain ranges or you name it, you know, anything natural, whilst also going with my family. You know, so that ticks off that value as well, like engaging my relationships whilst being on holiday, exploring these. It's brilliant, you know. And obviously while I'm doing it as well, I can learn things. Education is another important value to me. And I almost feel like that's kind of the trick, really. It's kind of looking at what you personally value and realizing that you can potentially tap into several of those.
The Venn diagram of it all.
There is, in that Venn diagram of these 3 things that you really care about, there's actually an activity you can engage in that gets all 3. Triple whammy. You know, like I said previously, you know, I've just come back from Norway, and I went with my partner and my parents, and it was wonderful because I ticked off about 3 or 4 of those values-based actions that tap into those values, and you can guarantee when I'm there on that ship with my family, you know, looking at the fjords with a cup of coffee in my hand, looking at the sunrise, like I'm happy in that moment. You know, I'm happy, and I'm happy because this is who I am. This is the kind of person that I wanted to be, and this is the kind of person I'm currently being. So really, I mean, the answer to your question is I don't know, because it's a very individual thing. All I would say though, to really like nail this point home, drill it home, is that when you're thinking about it from your perspective or from whoever's perspective, whoever's listening, really try and think about what it is in your life that makes you happy. What it is in your life that makes you like tick, basically. What kind of things make you feel good? What kind of things do you want to engage in? What are your values? That's the main question. And they will be individual. They will be very individualized.
That's a great answer. It gives you such obviously an insight to you, and obviously your experience with your profession and what you do, but also I feel like people will take a lot away from that, and also wanting to be individual and personal and authentic. The last question that I always ask and like to finish with is almost the opposite of that question. If there was a habit or a routine that you don't do or you used to do, and you would like to reintroduce it or just introduce it to your life, what would that one habit be and why?
Yeah, so it's a good question, very much so, because it means that I can bring this out, this book. I've had it on my lap fast out. I again, the as you say there, it's kind of the opposite of what I've just said. It is a very individualized thing, but for me personally, I think the answer is something that I think is important that I don't do, which is look after myself, look after my physical body. I'm generally quite good up here, but there are, over the years, have been things that I've thought, well, I'm not really doing this as well as I should be. I've always been quite an active person. I like climbing mountains. I like hiking. I don't do it as much as I should do, or I don't like the word should, but I don't do as much as I want to. So it's about trying to make a conscious effort to do those things. But in so doing, I'm also going to benefit my physical health, mental health, and so on. But one of the reasons I like this book is that you discuss all these things quite well. So, for example, that idea of movement, like get your steps in. It's a good idea. Hydration. I don't drink enough water. Like sleep. I tend to go to sleep at 12 o'clock and I wake up sometimes like 6 or 7. I mean, that's not ideal, is it? You've got other ideas here. I mean, mindfulness is one I'm pretty okay with. Like eating habits. And then, of course, going to the gym or going for a run. I've been trying to get into jogging lately. One of my friends, he loves jogging, and I go with him every now and then. I go with him maybe every 2 weeks or something, and we try and do 5K, and I can do it. And it's tough, but I feel good after it because I know that I've tried to tick off that. But again, it very much comes down to your values. You might be the kind of person that thinks, well, looking after my body. I mean, you'd think it would be a given that it's the kind of thing you should do. And it's not necessarily something that you enjoy doing, like we were saying before about the 4K, on the treadmill. It's tough going. The idea of not going for that chocolate bar there, instant dopamine rush. It's great. It's a wonderful thing, but it's not going to be good for you. And I do think for me that really is the answer to this question. It's one of the reasons I like this book so much that you wrote, is that even just reading this made me think, I know that I'm living authentically, but my body kind of isn't. I am. My brain is, but my body isn't. I'm not really looking after myself. So, and there are certain things that even now, like I'm not doing the best at. But you can work on this stuff, can't you? I'm trying to get my diet under control. I'm trying to exercise more. I'm trying to sleep better. I'm trying to drink more water. So I would say that's it really. And again, people listening to this and yourself will probably be thinking there are things that I am currently like struggling with, or things that I'm not exactly doing, which are important to me. But it's nice to think, that there's no reason why you can't start now.
No.
Like I always hear people say this stuff, like, oh yeah, the gym. It's a good example. I'll start on Monday, or it's coming up to the new year. It's January, it's going to be January in 3 weeks' time. It's first, second week in
new
December.
Year, new me.
Yeah, well, do it now.
Exactly.
Do it now. If you want to do it now. Like if you want to make a start on this stuff, do it now. There's no reason why you've got to wait for a specific, time period that's just ambiguous and doesn't mean anything anyway. 1st of January. What does that even mean? It doesn't mean anything.
No,
you want to do
and
it.
It's just delaying the inevitable, isn't it? And I think you may as well just act now and then build. As long as you take one step, that you have to take the first step to get anywhere. And I think that is probably the best way to look at it from my perspective.
Definitely. And I think for me as well, one of the most important aspects to this as well, and it comes down to that point I mentioned about relationships. The best results I find is when you have support. I am useless jogging by myself. I can barely do a kilometre. When I'm with my friend, no problem. When I'm dieting, I'm useless by myself. When I'm doing it with my partner, brilliant. If I'm climbing a mountain, I'm happy doing it by myself.
But when
you share the experience with someone else, it's 10 times better.
It's the accountability, isn't it, and the community aspect of it. We're social creatures, and I think again, there's a lot of things like being a lone wolf and doing this and doing that. But if you're accountable and you've got community and you're authentic and you have your values that well, I think you can't go far wrong from that. And I think that is the perfect way that we can end this. But before we go, I'd like to give you the opportunity to, if there's anywhere where people can find you, or any sort of social profiles that you have where people can check you out and the work you do, or anything.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really use social media. To be honest, I can't stand it. Interestingly, in your book, there's a section about digital detox.
Yeah.
Which I looked at and I'm like, well, I do that. I'm good at that one. I don't particularly like social media. I think it's just not a good environment. I tend to think that if you want, encouragement and everything, you probably better places to find it. And then again, some of it's obviously very good.
Yeah.
So I don't really use it, but the best probably way to get hold of me would be via my email for Edge Hill. I'm psychology department.
Yeah.
I am on there if you want to look. But no, that's it. I think for me, really, just like the most important aspect of this is just to, like I said, encourage people to try and live more authentically by thinking about like the things that they value in life, and that like we said, Venn diagram, that sweet spot of valued action that maybe does like 2 or 3 values at the same time. Based upon what I've read, the research I've done, I'm convinced that being authentic, engaging in your values, leads to happier well-being, happier disposition.
I think it's amazing what you do, mate, and I'm very grateful that work together, we've had the opportunity to meet and we can talk about these things. A like-minded individual, and it's really interesting. So,
and I enjoyed your book as well.
Thank you.
It's really good. Even from the perspective of someone that's looked at this kind of stuff for 12 years.
Yeah.
There are things in here that I've read that I think, you know what, I need to do this. I need to work on this. So just because you
means a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, it's good. Just because you do this stuff for years and years, and and I remember someone once called me an expert. I don't feel like an expert, but I mean, like a few months ago, I went to see a therapist.
Yeah.
I thought I need to speak to someone.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that. It's understanding that that there are people out there in your life that can make your life better as well. So thank you. I really enjoyed reading this. It's really handy.
Thank you very much again for coming on, your time, and we'll definitely do it again in the future.
Great, I like that. Yeah, thanks.
Perfect. How was that?
Yeah, good.
We easily did. Let's see how long we did. If it decides to stop. We easily did an hour and 5.
Cool.
Flew by.